Hello, and welcome to Mondays on Tuesdays podcast. Today we're doing something a little bit differently for a very good reason, which is that I have a special guest with me to share this journey of wide speculation. I will introduce in a few minutes my good friend Matt Arnold, who is also one of the earliest Compare Basic crowdfunders. Very much appreciated. Matt Arnold is an innovation consultant with a wide, varied background and a brilliant mind. My first experience of talking to Matt when he really got my attention was when he sent me the adoption papers. The update from Compare Basic, just before I introduce Matt, is that it has been a big week of a variety of different things. And one of them is that I finally was able to run payroll, even though it was tiny. The paperwork nerd in me very much enjoyed coordinating the unemployment tax with my local state of Iowa. I found a fantastic payroll provider. It's early, but I believe Patriot Software is one of my favorite user experience companies. Um, I also got the build system finally ironed out to function. And what's really, really exciting about that is that there's basically two targets. The first target is getting developers to build this thing so they can have a look. Second target is getting a login website so that investors and crowdfunders can see more of what's going on. Both of them moving very well. And without further ado, I will introduce my good friend, Matt Arnold. Matt, hello.
Hey there, happy to be here and congrats on all the progress. I enjoyed hearing the update.
I just want to give nod to our mutual technology woes. We had a failed podcast recording last week, and and I felt bad because you said some really cool things. I hope today's a little more structured, which would be nice. But one of the things I wanted to ask was not necessarily to introduce yourself because that kind of puts you in the position of like awkward meeting someone, for the first time at a random wedding scenario. But if you were to introduce yourself from the perspective of like what the world could need more of that you do, what would that be?
Well, it's a great question, and I'll make it as you're working against. I'll make it as wedding reception awkward as as I can. No, the really the thing that I really focus, even though over my career it's been under the space of strategy, innovation, and brand and user-centered design, it all really for me comes down to collaborative sense making. How do people understand what's going on around them? What's the issue they're dealing with? How do they align around that? And then how do they take action, especially in spaces where you're navigating uncertainty or complexity? And all of those I could nerd out on, but basically it's trying to get people on the same page on what they're testing, what their assumptions are, and what their next steps are.
I gather from our conversations over the last like mostly sort of year and a half, 2 years, that your experience is kind of a variety of big and small.
Yeah, yeah, and half my career has kind of been internal, as like a direct employee, and half of it has been as a consultant. But yeah, to give you kind of scope, like I've led design for a small boutique design company. I was at an early startup. I was employee seven for a company that was deploying TV over the internet. So kind of early days of how do you protect geographic market areas for local TV and yet uh, leverage the internet? And then also done State Farm, Allstate, Nike, Thomson Reuters, uh, Amtrak. So kind of different sizes of different industries. And then I was also in the early days of for-profit and online education. For 7 years, I was at a company called Capella University. So kind of a wide variety of big, small, for-profit, nonprofit in there.
We'll be right back after the music plays to dig into the difference that innovation makes in big and small places. Well, so I, during the introduction, I thought of a question. I like these things to be ad-libbed, but also
Yeah.
have a good amount of variety.
Yeah.
I hope we don't go off on a tangent and the listeners like, wow,
Yeah.
they sound like they're having fun, but I don't know what it means. So I think I'll start with this question. How do you so how do you see the difference between innovation in big and small companies? And I'll share my position, which may be biased, which is I really don't think there is one. But do you think there's a difference between innovation in big and small companies? And then what have you seen in terms of the approach in different settings?
Yeah, I do believe there's a difference between big and small, and some of that might be, thinking about startups like the 0 to 1 path versus scaling are different. I used to teach an innovation class called Leading Innovation at the University of Iowa in the College of Business, and its focus was innovation in the large enterprise, so it wasn't geared for startups. And part of that is I argue almost by default startups are doing something innovative. They might not use that word, but even the term innovation creates a lot of challenges on its definition, its meaning. But in large organizations, the number one reason innovation fails is due to turf and politics, and you just don't have the issues, or at least at that scale, in smaller startup companies. And so, yeah, I do think there's a difference, and innovation is difficult for different reasons based on the context.
Interesting. Very interesting. Well, I'm thrilled to hear that you've seen the difference between those two places. Um, when a company brings you in, is it because they are innovative and they want another team member, or is it because they are non-innovative and they want you to fix them? What?
It's a mix. I think some of it is like they know that something's not quite right when it comes to innovation, and companies that I've worked with feels like they can't necessarily name their problem. Like, hey, this is an innovation issue, but they can clearly identify their symptoms of what they're experiencing, which uh, tend to be like uh, loss of market share or loss of margin, and then some wonky behavior, like customers are doing something different, we don't get it, or even internally on the human side, there's just some really strange behavior, and we're trying to wrap our mind and arms around it. uh, yeah, so when I come in, sometimes it's through a product door, like there might be a new product, or a new product feature, and other times it has been in class, like here's an innovation team, and they're struggling, and so working both strategy and tactics to basically get traction for the innovation efforts in that organization.
That's very interesting. So it sounds like so it sounds like you're usually invited into a company that is assumed to be broken by the time you get there. Is that usually true?
Yeah, yeah, I'd say that there's some type of issue, right? Like one
Yeah.
example, and I won't name the company, but large global company. They knew they needed help with innovation. It was stuck, and this highlights just even some of the issues in your first questions. Uh, Basically, working with this team and even trying to figure out who owns innovation in the organization. What does innovation mean? And was getting different answers, or like a lot of I don't knows. And yet their annual report, and I had shared this with them, I looked at their annual report, just did a keyword search on innovation. Term innovation was mentioned 103 times in that annual report, yet
Yeah.
internally they didn't know. And so, like, one of those challenges is organizations trying to present themselves to the street is, look, we're innovating, we're trying to be innovative, and internally they don't know. Handful of studies out there that tend to indicate that innovation tends to be one of the top three priorities for leaders in large organizations, and the same studies will say that roughly 75% or more say that they're ill prepared to innovate. And a lot of
Yeah.
those are almost fundamental basic issues. Like at times it's almost head scratching at how basic some of the issues are that can get them unstuck.
Hmm. I think if not in our last failed recording, I think we've touched on it before, the idea that when someone needs to say they are innovative, it raises the same red flags to me as when someone needs to tell me they are a nice person. If you have to tell me, it's because there is some doubt, and now I am not only nervous, I am quite convinced that you're an asshole.
Yeah,
Um, and so when a company says they are innovative, it has the same. I receive it the same way, which is this company is saying they are innovative because they know that is in question. And innovative seems like a normal, natural, part of business that shouldn't really have to be said out loud. I'm really curious. I think that in my experience, smaller companies just kind of say, "Hey, we have something to do," whereas large companies kind of wrap it up in, "Our customers are behaving funny, and we'd like to move the needle on adoption." And it's basically a fancy way of saying
yeah,
we have work to do. Um, what I'm particularly interested in about your experience, because it sounds like you've been in really interesting places, is when a customer can't really express what it is they need. Um, Talk about some of the real interesting circumstances you've been when you presented back to them what you had discovered that they needed, and it was not what they expected, and like where do you go from there?
yeah. And the funny thing about some of that, it's usually presenting back to them almost their own words. Like, hey, we sat down, or a lot of times I'll do in-depth interviews with certain department leads or certain subject matter experts, and present back the findings to them. And some of them are like, oh, I I didn't know that was an issue, or I didn't know that was going on. And it's almost like in my really early days, I used to show internal like process maps. Here's your workflow, and people not knowing like entire like a business not knowing how major parts of their business operate. And so some of it
Yeah.
is just, yeah, shining light on that. Uh, I will say some companies, some leaders are much more defensive than others. Like some are like, this is great. We just got to get everything on the table and work from there. And, and that's the spirit of it is, the past is water under the bridge, right? It's not
Hmm.
about pointing, it's about getting better. And so what are we going to do to go forward? And unfortunately, back to politics and turf, sometimes there's egos involved. Like, somebody doesn't want to be the person that is seen as trying to sink innovation, in the innovation context or in just general business. They don't want to be the people seen as the bottleneck.
Yeah. Yeah. It totally makes sense to me that people just seeing what they are actually doing is in fact the key to innovation.
Right.
Um, I remember I was at a company that was doing web design for a major U.S. hardware store. In America we have like 6 to 10 hardware stores that are all absolutely massive. I'm talking like Home Depot, Menards, Lowe's. I think there's like 3 or 4 more, but I can't think of them. But these are like so huge. Like you not only could build an entire house from this store, you probably could, if you had enough trucks, you could walk out with the material to build an entire office building from one location. I mean,
Yeah, right.
they're just these they're absolutely massive stores, and because of that, they have so many departments. And I remember we were working on this website for them, and there was discussion about making the navigation better, and they mentioned that it was an infighting mess because the tools department wanted to be first so that they could have sales, and the roofing department wanted to be first so they could have sales. I remember thinking like this is insane. Like literal navigation of the website is being impacted by everybody like trying to be first out of the gate to have their thing sell. And so yeah, that sounds a bit like what you're talking about.
Yeah, it
Um,
reminds me, some of my early days were in like early e-commerce and web design projects, and I remember the ego battles of the homepage, like at who
yeah.
was going to get priority on the homepage, which quickly the homepage really didn't matter, right? Because everything was indexed and there were so many deep links. But yeah, that's like who's important, who gets to make the calls, and uh, and part of that too really is predicated on does a business really understand the business that they're in or how they currently create value or how they hope to create value, right? And that's where we like
Yeah.
companies that have failed in the past, I think, look at they don't quite understand the business that they're in, or they've been on autopilot for so long. Not to go
Yep.
too deep into some of the cliches, but right, Kodak at its prime was a memory sharing company, right? That's how you capture and share memories. But they over-indexed or saw themselves as basically a chemical engineering company, right? They kept talking about the paper, right, and the quality of prints that they
I
would get.
see.
And deep down, they had the first patent for digital photography, which they killed because they didn't see the value in it, or they uh, they thought that it might be cannibalism and eat away at their core business. And obviously, there's no business now for Kodak. But the fact that they engineered and had the
Wow.
solution for digital photography, uh, but they, if you look back at what they were trying to promote, it was always the quality of the print and not, like looking at how do we reduce friction to help people capture and share memories. And just that framing does a lot to say, like, oh, okay, if that's the case, here's what we might do. Here's where we might experiment. Uh, and so
Right.
those are just like certain challenges. And then, I think another big challenge too is just as organizations mature, because I see this less in startups. It goes back to politics and turf, but in general, it's kind of risk aversion, right? And so
Hmm.
people trying to play it safe, and that's one of the things I argue. Learning, prototyping, and experimenting. If you already know the outcome, it's not an experiment. But a lot of
Right.
companies are risk averse, and that's one of the hard parts. Is there is a lot of implied risk on small projects for innovation because you are testing, you're experimenting, and then ultimately it's about continuous learning about the environment around you. But that's
Yeah.
another challenge that I've seen not only past 10 years, this century compared to the last half of the last century is both in government funded innovation and in private business is that risk aversion, and a lot of it tied to stating and hitting quarterly numbers, right? Is that
Hmm.
it's harder to take longer term risks, and so you're going to see fewer and fewer kind of moonshots on what might be kind of down the road transformative innovation rather than just operational improvement.
Yeah, that sounds absolutely like my experience as well. And I know I had brought up before that I believe that's kind of because the accounting model of capital expenditures, which did a lot of good for the physical world in terms of spending a lot of money on something physical, a bunch of equipment, a plant, and not needing to declare that as a big one-time expense in your stock price because of the way what is the statement of the main four? I think it's the retained earnings statement that defines how a large expense would affect your stock price. And that is not possible with a largely human staff of services because you can't really write off a large payroll salary as a long-term investment in your accounting books. There's no way to spread the cost of humans over time, and so it kind of makes sense that risk tolerance for large investments is quite literally suffering from a lack of accounting strategies to explain
Yeah,
what you're doing.
yeah, a couple quick things on that. One is, yeah, I agree with you, and that is, even we see this more in the '90s and early 2000s, but organizations trying to keep Wall Street happy, right, and cutting labor costs, but then turning around and using more expensive labor through consulting and contracting, uh, like in almost entire like Best Buy, they're almost at one point their entire IT department they had let go, and then they were using Accenture. So the short term, it looked like, okay, we're not spending as much on labor. Turns out they were spending more to get the same jobs done because they were paying a consulting firm to do that. And on the accounting side, that is, there's no way that innovation can compete with traditional business units when it comes to accounting. And
Yep.
uh, like and even like marketing would always be seen as a better steward of today's money than innovation, because innovation you can't predict what's
Yep.
going to happen. right? But marketing, you could, if I just gave your marketing team $10,000 today, they probably know exactly what they do to spend it, and they could probably
Hmm.
show, maybe it's an SEO campaign, and based on
Yep.
conversion rates, here's what we'll see. And innovation, it can't do that, and so
Yeah.
it's yeah. So I think your insight on accounting is spot on, and there's actually a I can't remember the other author's name, so I'll just leave both authors out. But there's a book called Innovation Accounting, and it really highlights still the need for innovation practices to be rigorous. It
Yep.
shouldn't, it can't be the beanbags and scooters of the early web companies, right? Avoid the
Yeah.
innovation theater, but there's a rigor and discipline, but it needs to be measured differently so that you can
Yeah.
demonstrate the value that it's returning to the organization.
Excellent. Well, yes. So I will. We can do a bit of research after publishing the podcast and make sure there's links to that
Yeah,
book and some other cool stuff. And I would sort of summarize this segment between the two of us as basically that innovation is what happens when a company is well run and it's not, getting encroached upon by ego turf issues or risk aversion through, economic hard times. I think a number of companies become become seeking of innovation simply because, they sort of lost their risk threshold either, and it's usually not a personal or an operational thing. Sometimes it's just an economic reality thing. They don't have the liquidity, they don't have the positioning.
yeah.
And usually, again, people who say they're innovative are usually the ones who, may not be, because they spend so much time
The
clearing up a
protest too
perception
much,
that,
right?
yeah, right, exactly, that might be real. um, and I I think we're about running out of time, and so I will ask whether or not you want to go over the Wikipedia adoption stuff now, or if that should be an episode for the future. I thought I'd ask you.
Yeah, I think maybe touch on that one in the future. I'd be happy to return to that.
Very good. Yeah, I think sometime in the next few weeks we can go over that Wikipedia material. If you'd like to check it out, and I will also put a link in the podcast. It's literally, if you look up adoption on Wikipedia, it has all kinds of social scientists, and like it's my favorite Wikipedia page. And a shout out to them real fast. I know they are fundraising, and I have donated to them in the past, not recently, but I plan to donate to them again. And if you value the sort of free and fair internet that Wikipedia provides, I highly would recommend chipping in some dollars. I'm a big fan of putting money into what you believe in. Um, and speaking of clearing things up on the podcast, yes,
Yeah,
last podcast I announced that I was kind of going to grab a day job and do this less often, and I did some thinking and looked at the unit economics of the day jobs I can find, and I have not actually looked for a day job at all. So um, hopefully, hopefully, full steam ahead pays off. Matt, thank you so much. I found this conversation to be wonderful. We will absolutely have you on again, and I hope everyone has a great time and a great week. My name is Firecrow Silvernight. This is Matt Arnold. You can find me at comparebasic.com. Matt, I believe your best URL is inspiredbyspark.com. Is that right?
that's right. Yep.
That's
Yeah, thanks for
inspired.
having me on.
Fantastic. Awesome. Any last words before we say goodbye?
Uh, uh, just one thing, yeah, just one if I could just help
Yeah.
anybody on the innovation front, it is really like if organizations could rebalance for exploration, right? And that exploration to drive basically continuous learning and look at ways that you could fund learning rather than just outcomes, because that's what the innovative companies are doing.